Our next speaker is one of those guys that doesn't necessarily always say a lot, kind of one of those strong, silent types. But when he does say something, you just want to stop and listen. He handles life with a measure of grace that I admire. And the subject that he's tackling today is one that is extremely close to anybody who spent any amount of time in prison. Please welcome Devon Adams.
Thanks, Nick. It's wonderful to see so many people invested in the topic of mass incarceration. Just the fact that you're willing to come inside of a prison to get our perspective on its effects is truly remarkable. And I'm grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you. So today, my goal is to direct your attention to a segment of the prison population that's often overlooked. These men and women make up around 14% of Washington's incarcerated. That's around 2,400 people. And to give you some perspective, that's enough people to fill our state's largest prison. And this number is forecast to double within the next 15 years. And given that the average cost to house these individuals is twice that of other prisoners, there's also a fiscal concern, especially when we consider the fact that these are the least likely to return to prison if or when released. So who are they? Well, I'm referring to the aging and elderly, or more specifically, prisoners over the age of 50. Now, looking around the room, some of you may object to this idea that 50 would be considered aging. And that's probably because somebody convinced you that 50 was the new 40. Who am I to judge? But in here, once prisoners reach 50, they begin to age at twice the rate of people in the community. And it's not hard to understand why if we think about it. Many of us lived unhealthy lifestyles prior to prison. There's limited medical resources once you're incarcerated. And then there's the high levels of stress that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. We end up accelerating the aging process. Unfortunately, individuals tend to reach infirmity and tend to be forgotten. But before I continue, I want to invite some of my elders up. Because I think sometimes when we talk about mass incarceration, we deal with subjects, data, statistics, and we forget that these are human beings. So please, Pops, Raymond, Mr. Bachmeyer, Ray, Mr. Wheat, D, Corn, Tim. Now I have to admit, I was once guilty of forgetting about these men, and I live with them. It's easy to do when you get caught up in the daily routine of life behind bars. The sad reality is we're socialized to mind our own business in here. But that all changed for me one day when I noticed something out of place on my way to breakfast. So every day, when we go to eat our meals, we have to walk through a unit day room in order to get to the dining hall. And it's important to note that the day room's original purpose is to create a space for individuals to interact with one another, study, or play card games. But on this day, I noticed it was being used for another purpose. Seated at some of these tables, there was a group of older men. They were hanging out with each other, talking. There were canes and walkers everywhere. You guys heard of the chain gang? This was the Kane gang, and they were deep. But when I saw him, I asked myself, what are they doing here? And that's when I noticed another gentleman. He was coming from the dining hall, and he was carrying this box. And inside of the box was a bunch of takeout containers. And he approached the tables, and he began handing them out, and they started to eat. And it was at this point that I realized he was bringing them their meals because they're incapable of using the stairway that leads to the dining hall. It was a sobering moment. And soon after, I had another shocking occurrence, this time as I was leaving the dining hall. It happened as I was following an elderly man up the stairway. He struggled to get to the top of these steps. And by the time he did, he went to the nearest stool about 3 feet away, sat down, hunched over, and breathing heavily. I was concerned. So I asked him, do you want me to get you some help? And he told me, nah, just give me a few minutes so I can catch my breath and I'll be on my way. So reluctantly, I went back to my cell. But when I got there, I couldn't get this image out of my head. And right around the same time, a friend of mine, who's in his mid-50s, he shared with me that his kidneys were failing and that his chances of recovery were slim. I didn't know what to say to him. Saddened, I just began to think of all the other people I'd known who had had this horrible fate of dying in prison. It's a tough way to go, to live out your last days in a place like this. All of it set in, and I started to look around. It was as if my awareness had been heightened now, only to see more and more of these older men experiencing this progressive aging process. And then there were others who were already so debilitated that their existence was limited to trips to the medical floor, to the day room to eat their meals, and then back to their cells. That was it. That was their life, day in and day out. How could you not be affected? I was. So much so that I began to question why men like this are still in prison. So I stand before you today with this same question in mind. If the evidence suggests that aging men and women in prison no longer pose a risk to society and their incarceration no longer serves a greater good, what is the purpose of continuing to keep them incarcerated? Is it because mercy and compassion for criminals doesn't coincide with our punishment model of justice that's thought necessary to meet society's objectives? I mean, I get it. We need to incapacitate people who pose a risk to public safety. It's also important to deter people who have committed crimes from doing so again and others who might. Incarceration and punishment should also serve to rehabilitate people so that when they return to society, they can function. And then there's retribution. We can't forget about this component of punishment because this one takes priority over the other three that I just mentioned. Society feels it needs recompense for the crime that is being committed against it. But to what end? Once an individual has shown that they no longer require incapacitation, do not desire to commit crime, and show that they have been rehabilitated, why does this seemingly insatiable appetite for retribution trump the release of people who are less likely to commit crime and much less be physically unable to do so? I ask this question because it seems as if this desire for vengeance, it outweighs the logic behind releasing these older men and women, many of whom have served decades, not a decade, but decades, and for a wide array of offenses. And this brings me to my next point. Retributive justice is supposed to be proportionate to one's crime. Yet there are countless people serving sentences that are devoid of proportionality. There are cases of accomplices to crimes serving sentences as much as 10 times longer than the person who actually committed the offense, or instances of individuals receiving sentences many times longer than what the crime actually calls for, simply because of enhancements being run consecutively, lengthening their sentence. And then there are those who are serving the same life sentence as a serial killer for low-level violent third strike offenses. It's like in crimes of similar severity, you'll find outcomes that differ in terms of years, decades, or even lifetimes. And then in crimes that have different levels of severity, you'll find individuals serving similar life sentences. It just doesn't add up. And keep in mind that these are only a few examples among many statewide. And some of the root causes for these arbitrary sentences are due to factors such as the county in which your crime occurred, your socioeconomic status, and unfortunately, in such a progressive state like Washington, race is an overwhelming factor. So if retribution tends not to be proportionate and often results in inequitable outcomes, maybe we should reconsider its role in our system. Now, those of us who have committed crimes, we need to be held accountable, and we need to be punished. But that punishment, it should serve a purpose other than revenge. In most cases, retribution should not require that we spend the rest of our lives in prison, especially when we consider the men on this stage. They've paid decades upon decades of time paying for their crime and shown true remorse for their actions. Studies show that they have a 2 to 6% chance of returning to prison if or when released. These men pose practically no risk. I have one more thing to say about retribution or vengeance. It's expensive, both fiscally and emotionally. On average, the cost of housing just these men on this stage is around $800,000 a year, and that's a conservative estimate. Can you imagine that money being spent on a school that needs additional investment? Or a program that helps underprivileged youth? Or what if we took that money and reinvested it in education or treatment programs for prisoners who are serving short-term sentences? Now, if we took all 2,400 older men and women in Washington's prison, multiplied that by their average housing cost of $80,000 a year, we're talking about $192 million. $192 million a year. Spending money like that on the elderly simply because you're mad at them not only unnecessarily punishes them, but also those in the community who are in true need of resources. And the emotional costs are high as well. If after decades of confinement, society is still angry at these men, think about the emotional cost that's being paid as people expect to find resolve in their lengthy or lifelong sentences. It's as if the time spent serving these sentences has not aided at all in finding justice or healing. Years have been spent harboring anger, and no one is closer to peace. Maybe closure and healing can't be reached if we rely so heavily on vengeance. Maybe something else is required, something more restorative. Because under this system, unfortunately, everyone continues to pay an unending cost. Everyone. And I hope that no one has taken offense to my words, because no offense was intended. I'm just telling you my truth, or our truth, as I see it from the prisoner's perspective. And that truth is, I've seen countless men die in this institution, alone, in a 6x9 cell that's similar to a kennel. And I see others as they slowly deteriorate, and I'm watching them go from healthy to sick, and they're creeping into this slow death. And in witnessing these occurrences, I just don't understand how society expects to find healing through these men's agony and pain as they perish. I'm convinced it's because you don't have to watch it, and it happens in obscurity behind 30-foot walls. I have to believe that if you saw these men's faces, you watched them deteriorate, and you witnessed the anguish that they endure, you probably wouldn't be so mad at them anymore. And you'd feel compelled to change your mind about the need for this vindictive style of punishment. Then hopefully you'd want to speak up and seek a better alternative. So I feel obligated to share with you the realities that my elders are experiencing and some facts around their circumstances, because they need to be heard. And since many of them cannot articulate the right words to begin a conversation around their existence within prison, I want to do it for them, because they deserve better. They deserve their freedom. And one day soon, I hope that they receive it. So please, the next time you're engaged in a conversation around mass incarceration, or you even hear one, remember these faces. Take a look at them. Please remember these faces. Thank you. I would like to make sure you guys give up a round of applause for my backup group, the Elder Statesmen.
Well, that worked out nicely because the next thing on my agenda is to ask everybody to stand up and stretch out a little bit. So, way to get them to their feet, Dev. We can just take a little stretch. Everybody want to just stand up and stretch? I know we've been sitting for about an hour now. Don't go anywhere. Don't run. Just stretch.